of Ash and Flo. This is Unbillable Hours, a podcast about professional services marketing. Stick around to listen to our insights, tips, and best practices to improve your firm's marketing and even your career. Hey Flo, we're back.
Hey Ash, we are back, and I just wanted to let people know that we'll dip into our best of archive because we're going to go on a little summer break like every other podcast, right? Just kidding.
Yeah.
Just kidding.
Yeah.
Actually, we keep going with new episodes, and we have a guest here today, and we're delighted to have you on. Aarohi Sen, who's a senior principal of thought leadership research at Accenture. And Aarohi, maybe you can add a little bit to this introduction, but you spent some time as a research, as a knowledge service provider before that, right? So you've been doing research since kindergarten, I'm guessing. I don't know. How's that come together?
Yes, 15 years and counting.
Nice. And we brought you in because we ourselves were interested, and we got a couple of questions around how do you actually do one of those big, meaty, flagshipy pieces of thought leadership research, right? The pieces consulting firm put out where it's not just a bit of desk research, but it's a huge, survey or interview effort, maybe even global that goes into it. How would you run such a project? Because that's essentially what you do for a living, right?
Yeah.
Cool.
Oh, all right. So when you say mid to large size, our definition for that is anywhere between 300 to 400K to all the way up to maybe $1 million. And that's significant spend.
Yes.
And so we try and take it seriously. But most of that spend is necessary, and it's always almost justified. I mean, no matter what kind of topic your research is on, if you're looking for a multi-industry, cross-industry kind of research spanning 10, 12 countries, you need to spend that much. You'll probably do a C-suite survey. The sample size you're looking at is anywhere between 1,500 to 2,000 C-suite executives, probably because anything below that is a sample not representative for your population. And and then that survey itself costs, ballpark numbers here, anywhere between 200 to 300K.
So the remainder of the budget you just mentioned is then people on the inside, experts from the consulting practice, obviously your team if it's a major effort, picking up the survey results and producing the actual thought leadership.
No, that's separate.
That's
the
extra
payroll,
on top. Okay. I'm taking notes.
Yeah, that's extra. That's payroll budget that we spend internally is absolutely separate. So 200, 300K is just the cost of the survey.
It's just the survey.
But
you said 700 to $1 million. So where does the rest go?
There's lots. So then you do the survey. If the survey cost can be inflated to about $500,000 if you want company names, and I always advise for that, because the thing with surveys is that you want to do so much more with the survey data. And if it's an anonymous survey, then there's very little you can do with it. If you have company names, the agency will charge you extra for that. And then, you can do a lot with the company. You can analyze their actual reported financial data. You can look at all different kinds of metrics. Now we're looking at stuff that's beyond financial performance, like performance on ESG metrics. If you don't do a named survey, you miss out on all that. And
nice.
So the cost can be, and then you want to do some interviews, qualitative, in-depth interviews with executives. That's about $2,000 a piece typically. If
And
you
how
want,
many would you typically do? So you have a sample size of 1,000 survey responses. Did I get that correctly? 1,000, 1,500 already from senior people.
Yeah.
And then you do on top how many interviews? One for each region or industry, or how does it?
Yeah, typically you want to do 2 per industry at the bare minimum. And then you want to also ensure that you have a good mix by function. So you don't want all COOs or CSOs.
Okay.
You want a good mix by function.
Yeah.
If you have 12 industries, it goes up to around 30 interviews, 30 to 50. That's another 60 to 80K. And then, so that's research cost. But then what we also do at the onset is look at costs we need to incur for analysis. And so there are agencies which do regular, they automate analysis on a large scale. So if you do industry cuts or functional cuts of your large survey, they can automate that analysis and, create hundreds and thousands of slides with minimal effort, right?
Thousands of slides, nice.
Yeah, things people love at some places.
I mean, to be clear,
it's a consultancy thing, regardless of where you are.
Audience, I think what you're referring to, Aarohi, is that these are not just 1,000 slides. There's 1,000 ways to cut a single chart. For example, if you have, again, you just said, what do we have? 12 industries. So you have just one type of visualization, I don't know, return on investment for a certain type of AI use case, and then people can select, right? Is that for which industry they want to have that? Which function does that happen in? Blah, blah, I don't know. So that's where it adds up, or it multiplies up. And before we lose all the remaining listeners who don't have $1 million in research budget, I should be clear. What I like about your definitions here is, a while ago we had Andy on from Grist. I have to put the research notes, the episode title in the show notes. And that's an agency that specializes in research-driven thought leadership. They produce the final pieces, and he believed very strongly in the value of adding these things you just said. He said, always go multi-industry, always, right, see if you can have representative sample sizes across multiple countries and so forth, because there's an increased cost, but the return at the back end, and he was marketing only. So he said, if you want to publish it multiple countries and you have representative data for each one, obviously that increases your chances of press pickup and so forth. So he advised on that. But what you just said there with the named surveys, for example, just to be clear, that's massive benefit for the practice as well, right? Because maybe they can use your research to drive some consulting deliverables, or they could come up with an account strategy or whatever. So you mentioned some very big numbers, but I'm guessing the actual value of the piece, once it's there, justifies the prices, right? So people should overcome the sticker shock, I believe. Obviously, if you're a 15-person consulting firm, it's probably not for you, but okay. Might be one day.
But this is assuming that you want your research to have a 2 to 3 year long tail, and you want to drive multiple client assignments with it. There are diagnostic tools and playbooks and everything coming out of it. And so there are so many assets that you can use and utilize and milk through the years for the next 2 to 3 years until your next big research comes in, because there's no way you can invest $1 million every year. That's just too much.
So maybe if I interrupt, maybe what could help our audience is like the considerations you want to take before you start this research. You're putting the money in, but then if you're going long tail, what considerations do you think someone's going into the research? What should they start with?
Well, I think, and this is probably also the biggest challenge, but one of the things we should look at is, will this serve the direction of our business for the next couple of years? If the stakeholder, if the business owner thinks that he's likely to change strategy in the coming year, then that's the end of the conversation. You should not go ahead and invest in something this big, because there's no way that you can morph the data to suit your new objective.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, I think I've seen it tried sometimes that there's something you can salvage, but it can be later. And I mean, talking outside our own consulting box just a little bit, I think a typical area where this happens is all the cybersecurity stuff, right? Like the
Yeah.
threat landscape changes like by the week, and then that might happen to you depending a little bit in which industries you play in. But so it's interesting because what you said, I want to dwell on this a little. I think it's actually a mindset shift for people because you had a few quite big numbers, but what you're saying is this is for 3 years, multiple pieces. So let's make it $1 million at the outset. But I think if you look at it at a per piece or per marketing campaign cost basis, it suddenly becomes, for lack of a better word, relatively cheap. Because what I see often happen in practice is a consulting firm goes and says, oh, we need a study in this and that market for this year. And then they spend, I'm going to make up some numbers, but somewhere between 35 and 75K for one of those, also empirically done, quite nice, but mostly marketing, state of the industry surveys. So that's 75 grand gone, but it's a one shot, or gone, invested, but it's a one shot exercise. But I think that's how many firms, most firms I interact with, think about this stuff. Whereas your approach is, let's have a discussion what could be strategically valuable for 3 years, and then do one major research effort, and let's maximize the returns on that, which I think by an on-campaign or on-piece basis, you might even come out with less than, I don't know, 75 grand per thing.
Yeah.
Plus you have the added benefits you mentioned, if I do a name survey and so forth, right? This can really drive, it's not just for my marketing function, it's for the business I have also.
Which is why I don't like calling it a research project, and which is why I think it's more like a program. It's a 2-3 year program. It's a campaign.
Yeah.
You can call it different things.
Excellent
But
point.
and then see how you can use it. And we're still getting returns on investment from surveys we've done back in 2016. We still have clients coming back because they've seen some research report somewhere and it still works for them. Because the thing with digital transformation, which is what most consultants...
That's another cool point, but I feel like I interrupted a little bit. So because Ash asked, how do you approach this? So you said first step is take a long-term view, right? Think of it as a program and make decide whether or not to head in this direction based on an assessment, right? Will this last us for a long time? So cool. What would be a second step, or what's a second thing as people
consider
approach it? Yeah.
The second thing is, as a research team in a professional services firm, we love our frameworks, and so what I try and do, or rather, what we try and do is we try and visualize the frameworks that will come out of this, and this is probably 6 months away from when we start the research, but it's useful to think about that and really invest a week or two thinking about all the frameworks that will come out of this research, because that's what sells in the end. And your survey design, the questionnaire itself, what kind of research tools you pick will all decide whether you can make a framework work or not. Yeah. For example, let's you have a framework which ties investments in carbon capture technologies to financial gains. Now, there is no way you can create a reasonably intelligent framework to show that if you don't have a survey with named companies, for example. If you don't get, if you survey companies below the $1 billion revenue threshold, again, that framework will not be possible. If you interview people only from the sustainability practice, again, you can't make that framework, because what you need for any reasonably intelligent ESG framework is a multifunctional view of how ESG investments impact growth in other parts of the business. So, which is why it's so important to, visualize and talk to your stakeholders about what kind of framework you want to sell at the end of this exercise, and then work backwards on your research design and what research assets you want to invest in.
Which I love this. Sorry, I'm sort of repeating back to you what you just said, but I want to call out these points because again, what is the difference I see here between what you just said and what I often see in the field, quote unquote, is clearly you make this about a framework that informs service delivery and business development. So you're not even thinking about, ooh, what's the marketing angle? How could I get press from this? Which that is what I see happen. Honestly, in the better cases, like some of the research projects I see, they work better because people sit down at the outset and think about, what type of press coverage we want to elicit, or what could be the story here, right? That is a pure play marketing approach. With you doing it the other way around, you say, no, let's build something for the business first, really validate it through the research we then drive, and eventually repackage that essentially, right? So we have a marketing thing going. That's neat.
Yeah, because those $1 trillion figures that you need for a headline will come eventually, and it's needless to fret about that at the onset because if you tee up a good economic modeling team, or if you work with a vendor that knows how to model, company level financial data into macroeconomic impact numbers, then you're in a comfortable position. What you don't want to do is, this is research for businesses such as ours is not an exploratory research. There's some exploration in the process, but we need to come out and deliver business outcomes. And
typically you don't have to do the exploration because your consultants do this, right? They work with the clients, so they have a good understanding of what, like the business has some idea of what needs exploring, right? Which is why you probably get early into why you can get into the framework thinking and the so forth. It's really fascinating because you seem to be thinking about all of this much more like your program's objective is almost like a product development thing for the practice, as opposed to it's an input to a marketing campaign, right?
So,
which I'm not saying it's bad. I'm just saying you're playing a completely different game here.
Well, I'd like to add, Flo, like what Aarohi seems to be saying is mostly apply the scientific method more than like just applying what is the market-driven outcome. The question I do have, because of a lot of listeners might ask this, is how do you avoid, like, and I know this goes into the next segment, but how do you avoid things like confirmation bias and everything? Because clearly when you're going in with the position, you have some givens, and sometimes you're trying, like, if you're going in a science way, you usually are trying to disprove what you're going to go out with. But if you're going in a consulting way, you might be looking for confirmation for a hypothesis you have. So
your framework,
so things like this, how do you help manage? How do you like avoid in some cases, etc.?
Yeah, it's an occupational hazard. I'd say when, most often there are frameworks that your leaders want to go to market with, and the job of research is to prove or disprove that and validate that to a certain extent. And the hope always is that there will be some version of that framework that we can finally go to market with. And what Flo said, we do have a very solid hypothesis when we are going into these research efforts. And there's always a risk that these hypotheses will get disproven, but there's always a good story on the flip side.
Which is funny because I thought about that. I said sometimes the best, and now I'm talking marketing only, but sometimes the best stories come from when you are surprised by your own, like you had an expectation A and to your own surprise, you find something completely different. Okay. Sorry, Aarohi, sad instance for the framework idea, but marketing now has a great story because they look at this, like nobody expected whatever axis. Even we didn't expect, right? That's some way to get something out of
for
it.
example, a few years ago, we did a research where we thought that it was all about cost optimization, and players in the industrial space wanted to optimize costs. That was our hypothesis going in. And then we looked at the data, and then we said, look, the data says they're spending more, and they aren't hesitating spending more. There's more cost involved. The costs are rising exponentially year on year. And then we were able to say, maybe they want to incur those costs. Maybe these are costs which are looked at as investments. And because, naturally, and I'm going into a research deep dive here, but normally what you look at, what's reported financial data, you can interpret it so many ways.
Which I think there's maybe putting this a bit together is what I'm hearing is the risk of you being completely wrong at the outset is very limited, because also in part because of the approach you take, because you've had this discussion, will this be important for the business? So the research hypothesis is very close to the firm's core business and to its core expertise, right? That automatically reduces the likelihood of it being completely BS, right? Because if your consulting firm is in business for more than a couple of years, probably you know what you're doing in that industry, right? So I guess that takes quite a bit of risk off that table. And then to your other point, yeah, sometimes there are surprising findings, but you might be able to still fill those in. I wanted to on your how to approach this, because I know that from experience that you don't go out, you have the hypothesis, the framework, and you don't now design the survey and blast it to 1,000 people, right? You do test samples also, right? Which I think that was first time I heard it was a bit new concept to me. Can you talk us through that a little bit? Like once you have the building blocks in place, how does the actual research project progress? Like you build the survey out, right? And then what happens? The survey questionnaire. Sorry, I should have said.
Yeah. So once the survey questionnaire is ready, we do pilot it in a couple of markets with across industries and countries, and we do typically 50. We field it to 50 executives, and that's all we need to see if the questions are working, if they're responding the way we expect them to respond. Like some of the questions can when we're drafting them seem very obvious, but then when we look at the way they're responding, we realize that we need to rephrase that. What also happens, and then this happened recently, is that when we launched our pilot, we were the conflict in Ukraine began, and so if such an event hits you at a time, you have time to adjust. You have time to recalibrate your survey tool. You can add more questions. You can relook at the questions you have and say, hey, this is not a 25-minute survey anymore. Maybe we should relook at the sample size again, because those are adjustments you can only make once you have done the pilot, which is why it's so useful.
And I don't know, maybe that's me getting excited about the obvious, but I hadn't thought about it this way before I was involved in some of those large-scale projects. But in hindsight, makes total sense to say, don't build a survey and then go out and do it. Like you might have to, like I did this probably for my master's thesis at university, right? You build one thing, you don't have much time. No, do the opposite. Test it, maybe tweak a test again, and then build it up gradually, because it is an expensive piece of research. You work for the actual fielding of the research, you work with vendors, right? I mean, we all know there's companies doing that, but you mentioned something earlier where you said there's even vendors who help with analysis. Like, where can I ask, where do you use vendors in large scale projects? What could I buy off the marketplace to get it done if I don't have all the capabilities in house?
Flo, if I can noodle on the question, it doesn't necessarily have to be large scale projects. I'm just curious, like, when do you recommend bringing in a vendor in general, regardless of the scale of the project?
So obviously there's a survey vendor, which is separate, but when it comes to analyzing the data, they obviously come in once you have 50% of the data in, because that's when they know the structure of the survey. They can see some trends shaping up. So when fieldwork is 50% complete, that's when we start to do the initial bit of analysis. So we get our if we are doing it in-house, then we start right away. If there's a vendor involved, we kind of send them the data to for them to take a quick look at it and create some it could be as basic as crosstabs between questions, or it could be some regression models even. That's the right time to bring in a vendor. It's especially useful to buy off the shelf analytics help when you have a diverse set of data. So if it's just survey data, you can probably do it in-house. But if it's survey data combined with financial data, which is reported by these companies, if it's ESG data, if it's multi-dimensional longitudinal data spread across multiple years, where because things like financial data, etc., it's analyzed differently for different industries. A financial sector would treat revenue and cost in a different way than an automotive industry would. So if it's multi-dimensional data, that's when you really need help.
And these vendors, are they? I'm presuming there's a sliding scale between they just execute what you ask them to, or they're even do they advise on the findings? Like they go through the data and come back and say, Mr. Sen, look what we found. We think it's interesting given the direction of your research. What's the level of their engagement, so to speak?
Yeah, no, they come up with the insights. So you
cool.
have to provide them a direction. You do have to provide them a direction. You have to kind of tell them that, okay, if this is the regression model we want you to run, these are some of the input variables we think we want, and these are some of the output variables we want, and then they can start from there.
Nice.
It can't be a blank piece of paper. No.
Yeah. Cool. I mean, so now the project is going, right? Your role probably changed from advising the business, designing the brief or the inputs for the research. Now you're suddenly you're sort of in vendor management mode, I'm guessing, and firefighting when things go wrong, right? Is that true? You sort of project managing?
Yeah. Service can get delayed a lot, all the time.
Yeah, I was going to ask about what are the typical what are the typical fires you got to fight in that stage?
Well, there are quite a few. So there is the typical delay where it could be Easter weekend, or it could be people going on holidays for some other reason. It could be a geopolitical event. Anything and everything can delay fieldwork. So we normally build in contingency. About 10% of the fieldwork time is built in as contingency at the onset. So that's one of the things we do. And then there's also quality of the data. Right? Normally, when you're doing a survey with company names, you get multiple responses from the same company. That's not always useful, so you want to check for that. Sometimes there are people responding and what they say doesn't match with the actual reported financial data, so you have to kind of QC that, and then let's say you lose 50 responses as a result, and so you go back to the vendor and say, hey, these 50 didn't meet our quality standard, or didn't meet our revenue benchmark, so can you do them again? So so there are all kinds of delays, but nothing that can't be solved for easily, I think.
Yeah, but now you're saying this, of course, because you know your stuff. So but I wanted to point out, I think what's interesting for people to understand here is that it very much pays to have someone in-house who can do these kinds of checks. Like you probably don't need like a full room of data analysts or statisticians, but it does help if someone, it's not just your average, sorry, not want to insult project managers, but not any project manager can run this, right? It's not a multi-agency thing. You have to be able to check the data, figure out stuff, even understand enough of the content to make a call like, oh, this financial data, these answers don't seem to fit bigger picture what I get from public reports and that type of stuff. I think that's a fairly involved effort from side of your team, right? So yeah. But if you spend $1 million on a research project, you should probably also have that lined out, the in-house capability.
Yeah, you need people, you need survey experts, you need people who understand corporate finance, you need people who understand general the macroeconomic situation at the moment, and then you need someone who can mediate between these people to say, because corporate finance experts can come back and say, yes, 60% of your data is rubbish, but then the survey expert will push back to say, no, in fact 90% of our data is good. And so you need a PMO there to find the right balance.
Nice. Which also, subtext for people here is, it's probably not someone who just left university. It could be if they're very good at stakeholder management, but you need someone who can, like you said, push back on serious people if you need to. Yeah. Just one more question to the vendors, and then I think we're closing on time, so maybe we can wrap by repeating the critical steps. But does that exist as something I can also buy from the marketplace, like the experienced, seasoned project manager just for these research projects? Can I have? Are there freelancers doing this? Like, let's say my firm doesn't have someone, but I do have the money and I would like to pursue such a program. Could I find someone on the outside, or is that not something you see?
The thing is, no. I don't think you have you can buy a PMO off the shelf. Now, you can't even buy all the different research streams off the shelf. To be honest, there are vendors who are good in doing interviews, and they can also do surveys, but they can only do B2C surveys. Then there are separate kinds of vendors who are great at B2B surveys, like interviewing other businesses. There are vendors who are great in data visualization, but not so great in analytics. And then there's the flip side of that, who are great at analytics, but can't visualize data, even if they're life dependent on it. So you need a multi-vendor approach in most cases, but for smaller projects, I've seen there are DIY tools, some great ones out there, which you can buy off the shelf and run a small survey, 2,000 consumer survey, 2,000 odd consumer survey, and then do analytics on it. They have AI models running which can analyze that data for you. You can do a lot if your scope of research is relatively controlled, and if if it's a research project and not a program.
Yeah, but we're discussing programs today.
So
I realize we're nearing the mark where we'll have to let you go back to your programs, to use that word again. But maybe in terms of a recap, so again, let's try and summarize the critical steps, or maybe the critical points you highlighted, right? The first one I'll put, and then I'll let you pick up the rest, Aarohi, if you don't mind. What we've discussed here is you should think of those as programs. Seemingly impressive price tag, but good ROI, because this will last you for a couple of years and you'll have several opportunities to create a return on it. I think that was the first thing, right? So think about the mindset, think about it the right way, approach it the right way. And then what did we have?
Then it's a framework, if I remember right.
The frameworks, yeah, right.
The hypothesis and the framework. Yeah. Think of those beforehand. Do a decent job at creating a good framework that aligns, that marketing agrees to, that your stakeholders agrees to, and then build out backward the research design from that. So yeah.
Yeah. Then kick off the project not by going all in, but have a pilot and a test. I think you said, and
Yes. Do a pilot, do a test, and reevaluate if you need. Sometimes we've done surveys where we realized after doing the pilot that we don't need a survey at all, and so we scrap that contract. So you don't need a survey and interviews and something else and a group discussion. You can pick and choose at that later stage too. So
okay, without
pause
having sunk
and
the entire budget, I'm presuming, right? Okay,
Yeah.
so that's a
yes.
yeah, good. That's a good one. And then we mentioned then it gets into multi-vendor, multi-stakeholder management, yada yada. I think your point there was make sure you have someone who really knows what they're doing and has a standing within the firm to sort these things on the inside. Because if I understood you correctly, while there are good off-the-shelf narrow focus solutions for a program like this, there's going to be lots of stakeholders, external vendors, and so forth. And someone has to clearly own that and sort of steward the program to its successful end, I guess. Right?
Yeah, when your research program is a program, you want your research tools to be very bespoke, and which is why you need a PMO who can balance that, and then who can push back on people's version of the truth, because everyone comes with data and says, hey, this is my version of the truth according to my data. You need to be able to balance those expectations as a PMO.
Nice. I think this is a great place to almost leave it. Thank you very much, Aarohi, for stopping by and giving us a more than a peek, actually, sort of a walkthrough of that. I don't know what's it called, right? The Premier League of research.
Of research, yeah.
Well, thought leadership is where it ends up for us, but you made it very clear that it's much broader as you pick it up. So that was also helpful. Typically, we ask guests at the end where they can find out more about you, given that you are still in the position you are in. So I'm guessing people can find you on LinkedIn, and I'm not going to ask for your next thing, but do you have a piece of research you're excited about? Do you anything you want to plug at the end here? Feel free to do so.
Well, that's a tricky one. Well, I am on LinkedIn, and you can find some of the research we've done there over the years that I've done. But it's also interesting to look at some of the articles that came out of it, and how they are so different from the research we publish. So that's a.
Can I clarify that? So you publish a piece of research which your team has worked on, and then there is a third-party article about your data or the subject matter. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah. So the byline articles we do, which feed off the research, can be quite tangential, and it's always interesting to read those too.
Yeah. I don't know, maybe we can have an offline discussion if you have a good example. I'm happy to put it in the show notes for people, because I think that goes back to the point you made earlier about the ongoing long-term return, right? The research might have been about X, but then there is an Harvard Business Review article which is about a tiny, tiny fraction of X, or even tangential, as you said, but that still comes out of the same basis of data points, which I think that's the one point I have at the end, Ash, is maybe a takeaway for listeners if they stuck with us, even if they don't have this huge large scale programs. I think this very idea of thinking about your research in more of a program character, and then really doing more based on the data you've gathered, that's probably a lesson like all of us can take away with, right? Because that's often, or even the small projects, I think, have lots of potential. It's not just the one PDF landing page and 3 tweets, right? You could think about how this could last you much longer in many cases. I don't know. Do you have anything else, Ash, or was that?
No, I think this has been a really good discussion, and I feel like our audience can learn a lot from this. So, yeah, I think we are good. And thank you for joining us, Aarohi. It's been great having you and having this discussion here.
Nice.
Yeah, no, thank you for having me.
We're on time. I'm gonna stop the recording here.
Thanks for listening to Unbillable Hours. If you want more, tune in next week. You know where to find us.